right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. Rebecca McLennan, who also helped organize this panel, is not able to be here today, but we want to give her our thanks. To Alex Schwartz, who has done the lion's share of the work to organize each of the panels that were inspired by this year's On the Same Page program. Brian Stevenson's selection, Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. In his book and his life's work, Brian Stevenson reminds us of the importance of fighting for Black youth. Black youth who, because of a history of structural racism, a history of racial terror, a history of white supremacy in the U.S., are not often afforded the benefits and protections of childhood. And I should say that Brian Stevenson encourages us to use that language, to use the language of white supremacy, of racial terror, to be specific, right, to tell the truth. For those who are interested in addressing the problems that this history has wrought, Stevenson encourages us to, as he describes it, get proximate. Get close to the problem or the people that you are interested in helping, in serving, and understand that the problem is not the people. To be sure, that is something that each of our panelists has done in their work, and I am thrilled that we'll have a chance to hear from each of them today. And briefly, just to say something about the organization, each panelist will have about 15 minutes to share some of the key lessons from their work, and then we'll have an opportunity for what I hope is a provocative and lively Q&A session and discussion. I'm going to introduce the panelists in just a moment, but let me start by introducing myself. As some of you know, I am Nikki Jones. Preferred pronouns, I should say she, her, hers, they is also fine. I'm an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies here at Cal. This semester, I am teaching an undergraduate course, Criminal Justice in the Community. And as you can hear, I have some students in the room. I also have some graduate students from my graduate seminar researching race, gender, and justice in the room. I'm grateful that my current students are here, and I hope to see some of you in my classes in the future. As a Black feminist scholar who's committed to examining intersections of race, gender, and justice, you can imagine I am especially excited for this afternoon's panel, which centers in the Black feminist scholarly tradition the experiences of Black girl, LGBT, gender nonconforming, cis, and trans. These are often overlooked populations in discussions of race, discipline, and punishment. And as each of our panelists can attest to, this invisibility comes with consequences. Their work also shows us that acknowledging this invisibility through testimony, research, and representation is a crucial step in transforming the systems that too often fail Black youth. As you'll see, the work of Angela Irvine, Monique Morris, and Patricia Boone also shows us the importance of understanding how the transformations of these systems cannot be isolated to one institution, whether it be schools, the juvenile justice system, or the child welfare system. Instead, as we'll hear more about in today's conversation, we must see these systems as mutually reinforcing. The racialized and racist, gendered and sexist, homophobic and transphobic logics that push girls out of schools and out of families are not distinct from the logics that structure the disciplinary environments in detention centers or the logics that can exacerbate the vulnerability of youth in the foster care system. Collectively, the work of our panelists demonstrates the necessity of challenging these harmful logics, of developing new language and new conceptual frameworks for understanding the problem and identifying and developing effective interventions. Put simply, and this can be hard to imagine here at Berkeley, the work that our panelists do is not merely a theoretical exercise. As we've seen again and again in the viral video recordings of Black death and Black punishment, of Black youth shot and killed in the street or thrown violently from a desk chair for the most trivial of offenses, there are real lives at stake here. In the case of Black youth, it is us, the adults, the people with power, the people who will have power, the people who run these systems, do so in the future, the people who vote, who bear the great responsibility of constructing the radically reformed spaces that each of our presenters imagine and call for in their work. I expect that we will leave here today not only with a roadmap for moving forward, but also with some inspiration as we follow that path. So let me now turn to introducing each of our panelists. Angela Irvine, for more than 20 years, Angela Irvine has been working on the front lines to change policy and erase disparities through education and systems reform. She's the Vice President and Director of Community Programs at Impact Justice and National Research Innovation Center, whose mission is to create a more humane and restorative criminal justice approach that is free of the confines of social and racial inequality. At Impact Justice, Dr. Irvine leads groups working to develop community alternatives to our incarceration and their work to identify risk factors that drive suspended students into the justice system. She is leading a national evaluation of community-based programs for youth of color charged with serious and violent crimes. Before joining Impact Justice, she was the research director at the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, where she worked as the principal investigator on a number of national studies looking at youth decarceration, as well as disparities and pathways into the juvenile justice system for LGBT youth and youth of color. Angela is also has Cal roots. She earned her BA from Berkeley. She earned a secondary teaching credential from St. Mary's College of California and a PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. Now we give her a hand. Okay. Monique Morris, who will speak second this evening, is an author and social justice scholar with more than 20 years of professional and volunteer experience in the areas of education, civil rights, juvenile, and social justice. Dr. Morris is the author of Black Stats, African Americans by the Numbers in the 21st Century, and Push Out, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, which is on our syllabus in our graduate research seminar. She's written dozens of articles, book chapters, and other publications on social justice issues, and has lectured widely on research, policies, and practices associated with improving juvenile justice, educational, and socioeconomic conditions for Black girls, women, and their families. She also has Berkeley ties as the former director of research for the Thelton E. Henderson Center for Social Justice at the Berkeley School of Law. She's also a member of the OJJDP National Girls Institute Expert Panel, the California Board of State and Community Corrections Committee on Reducing Racial and Ethnic Disparity, and other working groups designed to improve the education of children in contact with the criminal and juvenile legal systems. You can follow Dr. Morris, Dr. Twitter. You can follow Dr. Morris on Twitter at Monique W. Morris. I follow you. I follow her as well. And our final panelist also has Cal roots. Patricia Boone graduated magna cum laude from Cal in 2013 with a degree in American Studies and a concentration in race, law, and juvenile delinquency. In her thesis entitled Modern Day Prostitution and the Systematic Subjugation of the Black Female Body and Spirit, she argues that in order for Americans to see the humanity in Black female prostitutes, the idea that the Black body is incapable of victimization must be discarded so that Black women and girls are given the same priority, concern, and protection as any other victim of commercial sexual exploitation. In 2016, Ms. Boone graduated from Northwestern School of Law and co-founded Compass Blue, a synergistic and diverse consulting firm that connects people to their purpose, producing results that inspire global change. As you'll hear more about in her comments, Patricia draws upon her professional and personal experience to advocate for and work directly with youth and adults on the path from surviving to thriving and to the organizations that serve them. She speaks and consults extensively on issues related to resilience, at-risk youth, foster care, restorative justice, probation, women incarceration, and alternatives to the current criminal justice system. And thank you to all our panelists, and we'll begin today with Angela.
So I've been elected as the first speaker, and I am going to be the numbers woman today. And so I just want to say before I start that researchers have choices on who our subject is and what our intention, what the intention of research is. And I just want to say that as a white, straight researcher, there are plenty of white, straight researchers that are researching communities of color in order to somehow change communities of color, and that is not my experience nor my intention. I very intentionally think about it being my responsibility to think about systems of oppression and what can I do to collect information that's going to change those systems of oppression. So that's just sort of a general sort of philosophy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go forward. So I'm going to introduce a term that some of you may not be familiar with. SOGI stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and the last E is for gender expression. And so sexual orientation is who we're sexually attracted to, right, or romantically attracted to. Gender identity is who do we think of ourselves internally as boy, girl, masculine, feminine. It's an internal decision. Gender expression is how we express that externally. And the reason that I'm immersed in a group of people who are trying to improve outcomes for LGBT youth in the justice system. And the reason that we use this term is that everybody has a sexual orientation, everybody has a gender identity, and everybody has a gender expression. So rather than creating an other category or emphasizing another category of LGBT, we emphasize this term SOGI. I'm going to be using the term LGBTQ GNCT. I conducted several national surveys and a state survey of youth in detention halls. And I just want to say that I use this term with regard to my work because first of all, the first LGBTQ is a combination of sexual orientations, right? So lesbian, gay, bisexual, and questioning. The second grouping of letters stands for gender nonconforming or transgender. So gender nonconforming is a term for people that express their gender in a way that's not expected of their birth sex. And transgender is a larger category. Some people who consider themselves transgender have actually transitioned to a different gender, right? Or some people still identify as transgender when, for different reasons. But those are, the GNCT are letters that refer to gender identity and expression, right? We did not actually have any intersex youth in our survey, and no one identified openly as queer. So we use lesbian, gay, bisexual, questioning, gender nonconforming, and transgender. I just, again, want to state that there are many theories on juvenile justice involvement. I'm a sociologist. I'm a proud sociologist. I believe in structural oppression as being a driver into the justice system. Anybody who studies youth surveys where youth self-identify or disclose adolescent behavior, I think that most of you have probably engaged in similar behaviors as kids in the justice system, right? And some kids got caught and some kids didn't get caught because of where many of you come from. And so youth behavior is, in my view, generally the same across race, gender, and sexual orientation. But justice system actors respond differently to youth depending on their race, gender, and sexual orientation. So as I go over my data, what you'll see is there's this very sort of obvious building of structural oppressions that lead to the overrepresentation of different groups in the justice system. So I'm going to talk really specifically about some groups that we find in the justice system. And I'm going to use this fancy term relative rate index, but it's basically fractions. So if you look at the fraction of white straight girls that end up in the justice system, and you compare it to the fraction of white straight boys who end up in the justice system, for every one white girl, there are 6 white boys. So that's just a little measure of gender, right? Without taking race into consideration. And if you look at sexual orientation, for every one white straight girl, there are 8 lesbian, bisexual, and questioning girls who are white. I'm going to go to the next slide. So if you start to add race and sexual orientation all together, for every one white girl, there are 6 black girls who are straight. There are 31 black boys. And if you combine gender and sexual orientation, there are 71 lesbian, bisexual, and questioning black girls for every one white straight girl. The next thing I want to talk about is, so we can calculate these fractions because we know how many kids are in the justice system and we know how many kids are in the general population. We have measures for sexual orientation that are used in many different places. We don't have very many measures of gender nonconformity, right? So there aren't, when the Gallup poll goes out, there aren't these general questions. And so I don't have a relative rate index for gender nonconforming youth, but I'm drawing on some research that I did. Again, I surveyed every detention hall, ranch, and camp, which are secure facilities in California, to establish how many LGBTQ GNCT youth are in the state. And then we looked at at prostitution charges, which I'm using that term very specifically. Those are young people who report that they're in detention halls, ranches, and camps related to a prostitution charge, right? So there are other terms like trafficking, commercially sexually exploited youth, sex work. There are a lot of other terms. This is not a reflection of who's in the street. This is who gets charged with a prostitution charge. And so if you look at 4 different groupings, you can think about youth as straight and gender conforming, straight and gender non-conforming, LGBTQ and gender conforming, right, which means you're expressing yourself in the way that matches your birth sex, and then LGBTQ and gender non-conforming. And so if you look at the discourse on youth who are engaged in sex work and prostitution, there's a huge emphasis on essentially birth sex, right, or current gender identity. There's a huge emphasis on girls in general. And the reason that I have this slide up is that, as it turns out, if you look at gay, bisexual, questioning, gender nonconforming boys, they are the most likely group in this state to pick up a prostitution charge. So, and the reason that I'm bringing this up with this group is because we have to move beyond gender stereotypes. We have to move beyond a gender binary of girl, boy, right? That, because even if you look at LGBTQ gender nonconforming girls, they're also far more likely to pick up a prostitution charge than other groups of girls. And so this additive effect of multiple oppressions, right? So and I just want to mention, and I'm sorry I take this for, 90% of these youth are of color. So I'm going to get to that slide in a second. So there virtually are no white kids, right, in this slide. So it's this additive effect of racial oppression, gender, oppression because you're gender nonconforming that adds up to charges. And again, this isn't a reflection of behavior. This is a reflection of who's getting punished for this behavior, right? And who's getting punished in a secure facility instead of getting diverted into the child welfare system. Overall, I'm just going to kind of move back. I've done 2 surveys. I've done a survey of California. We did a national survey, so these are the national findings. And what we found is that overall in the justice system, 20% of youth are LGBTQ or gender nonconforming or transgender. If you separate that out by current gender identity, that's 40% of girls, right? It's about 12 to 14% of boys. But the overrepresentation of LGBTQ and gender nonconforming girls is staggering. And again, nationally, it's 85% of these girls are of color. In the state of California, it's 90%. And so the breakdown of that 85% of youth of color, 37.9% of African American, 32.6% Latino, and 11.8% mixed race or ethnicity. And if you dig down qualitatively into who's mixed race, those are mostly youth who are some combination of white, black, Latino. So again, it's this sort of, there are certain groups that are overrepresented and targeted. And so if you pull this all together, I have 3 main recommendations for you to think about. That we all as advocates, I think we need to start advocating that we begin asking about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in every measurement that we use, right? Because we have to again, move beyond gender binaries, and we have to understand who's on the spectrum in between. And really we all are, right? Like who really is like, the perfect whatever, boy or girl. We need to move beyond gender as only involving girls. We all have gender. We all have a gender identity. We all have a gender expression. And then we really have to think about how race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression intersect to drive justice involvement. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, I have to make sure that you're with me as I talk about this, because I want to pick up on some themes that were just shared. I love speaking to new audiences. And I like that we get a little 10 minutes? I might go 14. 15, okay, good. To talk a little bit about Push Out. So, Push Out, this latest project of mine, was really born of a desire to broaden the public discourse on how we are examining this school-to-prison pipeline. So that's actually a term I usually don't use. I don't refer to it as the school-to-prison pipeline. And I don't refer to it as the school-to-prison pipeline because in my work, I have found that that is too narrow a construct to capture the multiple ways in which girls, in particular, are vulnerable to contact with the juvenile and criminal legal systems. And when we're talking about a pipeline, we tend to think of a linear, one way in and out. And that is not the case. And when we talk about prison, who are we going to talk about? Men, disproportionately impacted by prison. And so I like to talk in terms of confinement because there are multiple ways of confining and multiple forms of confinement. And it's really important to me to say the word that captures the majority of our girls. And those are the places where we find girls. We see girls in juvenile detention facilities, in residential placement, in various forms of confinement, with ankle bracelets. The reach of the criminal and juvenile legal system goes far beyond a prison. And so it's important for our language to reflect that. And so that's why I use that term. So in Push Out is a term that many advocates have been using for years to counter the narrative that children drop out of school. That there are forces at play, as Angela was starting to talk about, these multiple oppressions that push certain children away from school. And for me, in this work, much of my discussion about what pushes kids away from school is about having a discussion about the policies, practices, and prevailing consciousness that facilitates criminalization. And that when we talk in terms of criminalization, we're able to see everyone who is impacted by it. If we talk about prisons, we'll only see what is essentially a symptom of a broader, much more pervasive problem in our society, criminalization. And so what does this look like in schools? How does this disproportionately impact Black girls? These are questions that many folks were not engaging. That much of even how we've constructed the problem, calling it a school-to-prison pipeline, was largely based upon a masculinization of girls' experiences, of an idea of a phenomenon. And so where it didn't look the same for a lot of girls, for boys, as it did for boys, those places were getting lost. And that's the place where I wanted to begin. So in 2011-12, the US Department of Education issued out some disaggregated data that showed that Black girls were the only group of girls who were disproportionately impacted by school discipline along the continuum. The only group of girls. They were 16% of girls who were students, but they were repeatedly overrepresented in terms of youth who were experiencing in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, corporal punishment, expulsion with or without educational services, contact with law enforcement, by referral or by arrest. And that the more we started to look at what was happening, it certainly wasn't that Black girls are predisposed to be more disruptive in class. There were a host of other conditions at play here that I wanted to explore. And I wanted to explore these issues not from the perspective of someone who, as an adult, has my own framework around oppression and my own framework and interrogation around identities. I wanted to take this from the voices of the girls who had experienced school pushout. And so I went into detention facilities and I talked to girls and pulled their narratives, shared with them in conversation. What was it? Asking them, just what is it, right? What is leading to this? What are you feeling? What has been your educational story? And for many of these girls, that was the first time anyone had asked them about their educational story, because so much in our discourse around juvenile legal system reform was revolving around how do we respond to these girls, especially girls who are commercially sexually exploited? How can we make them whole? How can we engage in these practices to bring systems together to respond to kids who are in foster care? All these things along the continuum. But when I looked at the list of who was in the room and what we were going to tackle in terms of making change, education was like number 5 or 6 on a list of 7 things. out of order because education is a critical protective factor against contact with the juvenile and criminal legal systems. And so if we know that, which we do, why is education so low on the list? And then having that conversation, or at least starting with that basic information, allowed for me to engage in a participatory process to pull out some of the ideas that were facilitating some of the consciousness, that prevailing consciousness that I was referring to earlier, that was facilitating this criminalization. And so I want to pause and read a bit from Push Out that talks about one of them. And this is an excerpt from the chapter called, it's about the attitude. And it talks about, for Black girls, it's a blues for Black girls when the attitude is enough, is the title of the chapter. And it's titled, They're Not Docile. I once asked a classroom of college students how they would describe the Black girl attitude. Neck rolling, one student yelled out. Eye rolling, finger snapping, said another student. Just ghetto, said another. It's infamous, that attitude. Even as you read this, no matter your race, background, or ethnicity, your mind is likely floating toward an image of a brown-skinned young woman with her arms folded, lips pursed, and head poised to swivel as she gives a thorough eye reading, and then settles into either an eye roll or a teeth-sucking dismissal. Or maybe you imagined her head tilted, her eyebrows raised, and her hands on her hips, one or two depending on circumstance. Or possibly you envisioned her face with a scowl, her lips slightly turned up to show just a few teeth. Across the country, the student identity of Black girls is often filtered, assessed, and understood through how much attitude she gives others around her. Discussed as if it were as concrete as eye or hair color, the Black girl attitude cannot be defined by some set of static traits or actions. For the purposes of this book, the attitude is an open inquiry, one that informs not only how adults engage with Black girls, but also how these girls identify themselves as young people and as students. Bell Hooks explored the attitude as a complicated component of Black femininity, characterized in the public domain as Sapphire, a character on the Amos and Andy show from the 1940s and 1950s. In these broadcasts, Sapphire was nagging and combative with her husband, Kingfish. Their relationship reinforced a narrative about Black femininity as dominant, overbearing, and unreasonably demanding of Black men, an idea that stands directly in opposition to the norms of what white femininity is supposed to be, which is passive, frail, and deferential to men. Both notions are incorrect and harmful exaggerations. The angry Black woman meme, a neck-rolling, finger-in-your-face, hands-on-hip posturing, is at the center of the public misunderstanding of what it means to be Black and female in America. In schools, this misunderstanding sometimes manifests when girls speak their opinion, especially when it is unsolicited, or if they stand up for themselves when they feel they have been disrespected by peers or by adults. When relationships between students and teachers are poor, Black girls may exhibit any number of behaviors that openly signal their dissatisfaction, including yelling at or using profanity with a teacher. Marcus, an administrator at a California high school, commented on a scenario in which girls could and do receive a disciplinary referral. I get referrals for the simplest reasons, he said. For a girl yelling, "I don't understand." A teacher replying, "Did you come to school to learn?" Earning the retort, "You come to school to teach?" You know, our babies can be kind of snappy. So the way they say it, it might have some expletive in there somewhere. And I mean, just overall, it's just that the sisters bring a lot of attention to themselves. They're not docile. Our babies can be kind of snappy. By itself, this statement reflects the assumption that Black girls communicate in a way that is biting and provocative. The suggestion that girls' tones must be mediated and their questions made less incisive in order to be tolerated in the classroom is both problematic and sexist. That the comment was made by a well-meaning African-American administrator reflects the pervasive and internalized nature of the angry Black woman cliché, which serves no one particularly well. Most often in this type of exchange, we're left with a standoff that leaves both the student and the teacher harmed. It usually ends with the removal of the student from the classroom, thus beginning or continuing a negative school experience that can have lasting effects on her relationship with teachers, her faith in her ability to perform well academically, and her commitment to school. In this case, the young woman was removed from the classroom, but should her learning really be interrupted because of her sarcasm, because of her attitude, because she's not docile. Students participate in constructing the school climate from the moment they walk through the door. How they see themselves reflected or not in the material, and how they experience or don't a welcoming reception into their learning environment, both the classroom and the school in general, all influence whether a young woman responds to others in a way that she believes is respectful. Because children co-create their learning environments, they either choose to abide by stated rules or work in ways to circumvent them. Discreetly or overtly, they are active players in their own socialization and in the socialization of teachers. Toss that dynamic in with interpretation and effective communication, and it means teaching is hard work, so is learning. When the teacher asked, "Did you come here to learn?" it may have been heard as a challenge to the girl's willingness to participate in reproducing that school's social norms, or worse, a challenge to her perceived interest in learning as measured by whatever characteristics that teacher may have been using, the student's chattiness, for example. Her reaction, "Did you come to school? Did you come here to teach?" called into question the teacher's effectiveness and commitment to her education. The implications of "did you come here to learn" might have triggered a feeling of inadequacy in the girl from her previous experiences in the classroom. Instead of saying, "Did you come here to learn?" the teacher could have phrased it as, "Listen, your education is important. How can I help you focus on what we're learning so that you can have your best chance to succeed?" This could have been followed by intervention and accountability processes that do not include a referral to the dean, but rather elevate the collective responsibility in the classroom and the unconditional belief that all students possess an ability to succeed. Of course, that's a reimagining of this incident, but it's not as utopian as it may seem. Schools are modeling this kind of love every day when they believe the children they teach are worth it. So I share that with you because there are multiple ways in which Black feminine identity may not align with what we might perceive as conforming, or and sometimes it doesn't have to do with gender expression. Sometimes it's about how well the expressive nature and cultural norms of a particular group align with the expectations of those who are in positions of authority in the classroom, outside of the classroom. We know that the increase in the instruments of surveillance, which is what I call them, the metal detectors, the law enforcement in schools, the security cameras, security at the front desk, all of these have increased the citations that have occurred in high poverty schools. And that when you add that to the belief among many administrators in these schools that punishment is the way that you respond to problematic student behavior, you get the disproportionate rates that are fueling this juvenile legal system and contact with it. There's also a need for us to address trauma. And I have been of late in a series of conversations, policy conversations, about the incidence of trauma, the failure of educators in schools to recognize trauma, and yet, we know that girls who are most at risk of school pushout are girls who have experienced some form of victimization, sexual victimization, and other forms of trauma and violence. And sometimes it is about who they are. There's a girl in the book named Paris who was transitioning in high school from male to female. And she was told by the administrators that she was a distraction. And so they discouraged her from attending school, which placed her at tremendous risk because she was out in the street at that point. And sometimes it's about girls who speak up and speak out, as is the tradition that we celebrate during Black History Month, that we celebrate when we talk about Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer, and we talk about all these women who were standing up and speaking out. But when Black girls are doing this in their spaces in schools, they're often seen as presenting as combative, or their questioning seen as an affront to the authority of teachers. And we can do better. So in the book, I spend quite a bit of time talking about what the better could look like, how there can be new relationships established, how there can be new ways to respond to problematic student behavior, how we can challenge our own implicit and explicit biases about the ways in which we construct and understand expressions of Black femininity, and how we can invest in better resources and more resources in the schools that are educating these girls. Black girls have always been at the center of the equity discussion about education in this country. Brown versus Board of Education was about Linda Brown, a little Black girl. And yet we don't think about that when we're talking about equity. We leave out gender, even though it is absolutely part of the fabric of our discussions about equity in this country. And so part of my challenge to all of us is to be much more intentional about how we work at the intersections. Not to just be aware that it's there, but to actually engage in the practices that move us toward a change in the outcomes. So I look forward to the discussion.
So just really quick before I begin, I have to tell you, I am feeling this wonderful feeling of just gratitude to be returning here, to come and present to you about something that I personally am so connected to, but also to be a voice for a lot of the voices that aren't in this room. And hi, Cara. Can I just talk to you from a heart space? Can we move from intellectual to heart space for a minute? Can I have your permission to do that? Okay. So for me, all my life I was told that I was trouble. The only difference now is that I'm celebrated for it and I get paid for it. Spending 25 years of my 34 years on this planet, cycling through the foster care, juvenile, and criminal justice systems, I knew trouble meant a different thing. I first heard that I was trouble at the age of 8, when I thought I was doing the right thing. It's a school day, and my bowl of Raisin Bran gets soggy by the minute. My eyes glued to the clock, counting down with each tick. Out the door and don't look back, I say to myself. While at school, I ask a classmate if I can stay the night. She replied, "You can come over and ask my mommy." The sun is setting, and I attempt to disguise my nerves as hyperactivity. But my new friend's mother knows something just isn't right. And so she asks about my parents and if they are worried. I try to answer without giving my secret away, but I just break. My head falls into my 8-year-old hands as I cry and cry, telling my friend's mother that that day I ran away. And I did so because of myself and 2 other little girls who were being physically and sexually abused in our foster home. I ran to get help. I ran to be heard. The authorities were called, and I'm in the back of a police car, again. But this time it's clear that I somehow did something wrong. The police officer turns around and tells me, "How can such a little girl be so much trouble?" He drives me to a psych ward for children. For years, I've heard the label trouble. While no one explained what it meant, I took my meaning from the world. No one ever wanted trouble, so therefore no one ever wanted me. I had taken that on as my identity. And so at the age of 13, I committed to living that label to the fullest of trouble and played it all out while getting pushed out of high school. At 15, living homeless on the streets, getting caught up in the street life, which involved prostitution, and eventually picking up an arrest record. And by the age of 25, I was on my way to prison. But a judge on that day, 9/11, and this was 7 years ago, saw something different. And that is that he saw something beyond trouble. He actually saw potential. And the reason that he saw that was because he actually, in front of the whole court, shared a piece of himself with me. And he said, "Patricia, I read your letter." And I was like, oh my God, he actually read it? Wow, okay. "I read your letter, and it sounds like you had a really tough life. And I want you to become that lawyer that you want to be and that advocate that you want to be for other people. See, me and you are not that different because I struggle with alcoholism. The only difference is I didn't get caught. And so you have the opportunity right now, if you want, to go to school." And so I agree, education is imperative that it be a priority because some people make it into the system and education is the only way out. That's true of myself, and now I'm a graduate of law school. Had he not have seen, thank you. Had he not have seen something different or at least challenged himself to go against that and say, you know what, I can look at a person for the potential and not the labels that we affix to them, where would I be and all the people that I work with? So, today I choose the label of force of nature. It's just kind of what I do. I love it. You know, I realized that that's what people have been saying all my life, was that I was a force of nature, but that I was just directed differently. I was really good at being really bad sometimes, and now I'm really good at being really good. But I find that actually some of my, the clients that I work with that have some of the most, I guess, quote unquote, egregious charges or are really labeled as monsters or so, are really this same force of nature. It's just nobody's had the conversation with them that actually the same label can actually work for you. And that's basically the conversation that I'm gonna have with you today from a heart space. Because I believe that we gotta start way before people even get into the position of getting into the systems. We gotta start with the way in which we treat each other. How are we referring to people? You know, what kind of labels are you putting on them so early that that becomes their identity and that they live it out and it affects every part of their life? And how we as educated people begin to write about it and use those same oppressive labels that do the same thing. And then we have systems that do the same thing. People are dynamic, and we have no dynamic labels. So, the central question in Bryan Stevenson's Justice Marcy book is how and why are people judged unfairly? And so this presentation focuses on kind of 3 brief points. One is that the visibility operates within labels for Black girls and LGBT youth in our systems. And collectively, I mean, a lot of times when we talk about these issues, we do it. We say, oh, just juvenile, just criminal, just foster, just probation, which if we don't change that soon, I mean, that's mass probation that's going to lead to mass incarceration again. But that's a whole different point. But we don't really look at it collectively and how those really feed into each other and what we can be doing collaboratively to strengthen that so that these individuals really have a chance to be individuals and realize their potential. Everybody should have an opportunity that I have to be up here today to speak to you. You know, I just happen to have a judge that got it, but why should that be the case? You know, I am not more talented than the other individuals I work with. But we have to start seeing people as potentials, literally, as potentials. So the second one is that labels don't have to be a bad thing. We live in a world of labels. We just can't escape them. A lot of people try to say, I don't label. It's BS. We all do, because we want to know, are you safe, are you not safe, right? Do we like it, do we not like it? I mean, unless you're just, a Buddhist monk, maybe you don't. But since we live in a world like that, then maybe we can start thinking about how we can create really dynamic labels that really work for a world that's really connected. Right? Force of nature. What are some other labels that we could come up with that would demonstrate potential and show that people are in a state of perpetual development instead of just broken? Because that's another label I hear a lot working within the juvenile and criminal justice systems. And that's used by some of the best advocates. And if we have some of the best advocates who are saying their clients are broken, then really where are we at? And then last is, if we seek a different experience for these youth, then we need a shift in public consciousness, starting with ourselves in this room today. We all use labels. So you have to really engage in some serious introspection and be serious about it. What kind of labels do you use that are holding you back and holding other people back? And how you can start shifting that right now. So for instance, I'm right now working with Hope Probation in Hawaii to develop a women's program. And people are on probation, they're called probationers. That is a horrible, horrible label. So we're like, why not call them hopefuls? Right? It's Hope Probation. These are individuals who we are hoping are going to have the tools, and not recidivate and come back into society. But we're also hoping that we're going to have a system that's going to allow them to do it. So why not create labels that work like that? Not probationers, but we still write probationer, ex-convict, felon, things like that. That's the stuff that needs to shift. And of course, another one that I'm very passionate about is foster care. Foster youth, even that title, people might say, that's not really a label that could be negative. But when you think of foster youth, everything that comes to mind is negative, right? The most troubled, the failed statistics, they're going to drop out, they're going to end up homeless, they're going to end up incarcerated. There's nothing, they're abandoned. There's nothing that's great about that. So I want to actually start using, and if there's any foster youth or former foster youth in this room, I'm starting today using a different label, and it's going to be miracles. Because that's how we should be referring to people. Could you imagine if you told a child right when they were taken away from their parents that they were a miracle from that day on? What a different system we would have. All I knew is that I had a 3%, well, at that time, a 1% chance of graduating from college, and I knew I had a fraction of that 1% of graduating from graduate school. And that within 18 months of my 18th birthday, I was going to be incarcerated, homeless, or on drugs. What? Miracles. We can start shifting that today. So I'm making that commitment that I'm no longer using that label. And I'm going to write that way, and I'm going to speak that way, and I want more people to do that. And I think as we start to do it, creating more publications, more media that actually reflects that, we will start to see people change at a heart level instead of just the mind stuff. This doesn't get us anywhere but stuck. This helps us move forward. So a few years ago when I was at Berkeley, the moment that I knew I was like on the right path was when I was taking a class with Frank Zimmering, who was juvenile justice, and we learned about labeling theory, which is sociologist. And it's just like, in a nutshell, it's just all about this idea that people become criminals when labeled and when they accept that label as their identity. And so it's not that the person is inherently bad, but it's that the labels we affix to people then produce those behaviors. So in that situation, I'm thinking more to myself like, well, if labeling can have that kind of effect, then maybe if we do more prospective, positive labeling, it can have that kind of effect as well. And so that's kind of where I'm asking you to go. As I'm asking you to go, that when you're researching or when you're writing a paper potentially about any human being, because that's what you're writing about. That's what these numbers are about. They're about people. Each person up there was a story, And when you're doing that, to really write about it in such a way that you're giving them not just even a voice, but you're giving them an opportunity to go somewhere. And I think that you can do that with the right labels. And so, from one force of nature to I know several out there, thank you for your time.
Wonderful, thank you. Outstanding, outstanding. We have time now, we're gonna open it up for a conversation. I have some themes, certainly some questions to interject, but I really want us to have space and time for a conversation. I'll just say this one thing. I love the way that, to borrow from the words of Patricia, the heart space and the academic and the intellectual, you really see a nexus of that up here on the panel. You see that inspiring the work that people do. You see that reflected in the representation of the people, the human beings that the panelists are each engaged with. And you see an appreciation and attention, each of the panelists mentioned appreciation and attention to language and interpretation and how we respond, right? How we think about people, as I said in the beginning, as the problem, right? Or is the problem located somewhere else in our reaction, in our language, in structural circumstances? So that's just one brief reflection that I have. And I want to open it up to questions and comments. Bree.
Hi, I'm Bree, and am I supposed to introduce myself? Well, I'm Bree, and I'm a legal studies.
You do you, Bree. You do you.
I'm a legal studies major, and I was recently known about the Justice for Ryan Turk case. If anybody doesn't know what that is, it's a middle school little boy who he's on the free school lunch, and he took a milk, and now was convicted for larceny for having that free milk, which is included in his free meal. And so I wanted to see what your perspective is on that case and what's going on with that case, especially because he is a middle school child. And once that is on his record, it won't be removed. And so how does that affect you or what you want to do in the future?
I have not been following that particular case, so I can't speak directly to that. But what I do follow and speak to are similar cases involving, what is ultimately an over reliance on school discipline to respond to normal adolescent, pre-adolescent behavior. And I think we have gone too far with the use of exclusionary school discipline and the way in which, we are criminalizing young people for being young people and for, in many ways, experiencing poverty. And, I think that's one of many ways in which we see ridiculous responses. I mean, I don't know if there's any other way to state that that's a ridiculous response to a young person who is hungry or thirsty. And much of that comes from a way in which we have failed to humanize children who are learning in poverty and who are learning in racially isolated spaces in poverty. And we, sort of talk about them as if they are, sort of the stepchildren, the not quite related to us, but in our family. The relationship is tenuous. We're not really sure how to deal with them, and that othering that is reflected in the language that I just used is also reflected in the consciousness that we apply to young people who are learning in poverty. So zero tolerance policies, that much of which facilitate those kinds of reactions, have got to go. The use of, that's a case where the kid got suspended. There have been cases where children are placed in handcuffs for less than that. Kids have been escorted out and arrested for less than that. And so it can get worse. And among younger kids than even middle school. And all of it is deeply problematic. So, there are a series of advocates who are working on it now. I don't know how much we want to talk about activism and engagement, but there are a lot of organizations that are mobilizing to address some of these policies. I was recently at a convening in DC. The White House Council on Women and Girls has been looking at this issue, looking at its relationship to trauma. The Department of Justice has been convening some discussions about it. I'm ready for this conversation to leave Washington and to come to spaces where education is actually administered in schools, in spaces where young people are marginalized, and where we have yet to apply a human lens to the way in which we respond to hungry, poor children.
I just want to punctuate what Monique said, which I think the institutional response to that little boy would have been different if he was white. And so I think that we need to think about that. And just in terms of new thought, the director of an organization called the W. Haywood Burns Institute, James Bell, has been writing a lot about how do we reclaim the childhood of youth of color, so that, and that he really feels like at the heart of our overall, our system reforms and system revolution, we need to reclaim childhood. And so if you guys can fight, I don't know, I think it's www.burnsinstitute.org. He has a lot of his writings up on his website. So.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add, we just have to really ask ourselves why do we fear this child? Mm-hmm. But we know why we fear this child, because everything in the media are black young men shooting, Chicago. I live in Chicago, that's why I'm saying it, right? So right now in the national news, it's saying you have something to be afraid of. And so in this kind of situation, I think people feel it's justified in a strange way through social control. But it's unfortunate, but it happens all the time. And it's become so regular. Just from not just the school discipline itself, but the metal detectors, the locked doors. Mm-hmm. You go into some of the schools and they look like prisons.
And the kids will tell you that.
Yeah. It is. It's like it's locked from 8 to 5. And you're just like, what's going on? And they can't move. There's no movement. So that is prison. So we're creating metaphorical prisons in our schools, in our neighborhoods. And then we're treating kids like they're criminals. but I think it just reinforces what we're seeing nationally, and that is that, do we have something to really be afraid of? And I think we have to start asking ourselves, is that true? And going down and experiencing it for ourselves, because we can't do it by writing. We need to get down to those schools and start doing something about it.
How many of you went to schools with locked doors and law enforcement? Look around. Not so many, right? And when you go to school in a space where it is basically preparing you to live a life on lockdown, you're being told through nonverbal cues what the expectation is for you. And so that is the prevailing consciousness that we are talking about changing, that mobilization efforts like the Dignity in Schools campaign is seeking to change, that mobilization efforts like the Communities for Just Schools Fund is seeking to change, that there are whole communities now that are saying, hold up, our kids need to be free when they learn. How about that? Or, wait a second here, we're putting a lot of money into surveillance, and we're putting a lot of money into fueling a system of oppression when education is supposed to be a tool for freedom and liberation. You don't get to Cal by living with a set of circumstances. You have to build resilience and an understanding that you can make it. So I just want to share that, because for many of us, we have no idea what it is to learn in a space that is criminalizing, or to learn in a space that sees your active engagement around critical thinking as an affront to authority. It's an expression of your brilliance when you ask questions. It's a demonstration that you're participating when you ask questions. That's not the case for all these kids. These kids, especially if they're being educated in facilities, the punishment becomes even more severe. Asking a question and being seen as an affront to the authority doesn't only get you suspended, it gets you in solitary. They may not call it solitary, they say go to your room and you're locked up. That's solitary, right? So these are some of the things that we're highlighting and elevating in this discussion.
Hi, thank you to all of the panelists for such insight. I'm a doctoral student here in education, and I went to that type of school in South Florida. And something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm also taking another course with my friend here, where we talk a lot about schooling as a site of suffering, specifically for Black youth. So I know we're talking about schooling as this place of transformation. So I think for me, how do we meditate on and realize how school really is a site of suffering? And when you think about notions of epistemology and knowledge production, I could say from my own experience as a Black girl in those schools, it was not welcome and it was not celebrated. And how do we move into a place of recognizing these students in these spaces and really transforming that site of suffering to a true place of transformation for all of us?
Oh, I love that question. Can I jump in? Okay. I love that question because that is really at the center of my work, not just writing, but the work that I do with the National Black Women's Justice Institute. We have a pilot educational reentry program in Alameda County that is transforming schools. We take girls who have not been well served by any other educational structure, who have been harmed by those educational structures, and we have facilitated a healing location that we brought the school into. And that's kind of how we frame it, right? This is a place for healing and repairing a relationship. We talk about restorative practices a lot in schools as the alternative, the primary alternative to the exclusionary discipline, the suspensions, the expulsions. And, restorative practices are really just about having an opportunity to repair relationships where there have been harm. And so my work is really about knowing that in the manifestation, the four manifestations of racism, which we know are institutional, individual, cultural, and internalized, that we have to take that same approach to developing new constructs of learning and new constructs of education. And so the repair of relationship is not only with individuals who have committed or have had some harm between them. It's about repairing a relationship between institutions that have also caused harm. And what that means when we know, the bottom line is that these young people need to get a piece of paper. They need to graduate, right? They need to be able to move on to their next phase of life with some degree of confidence. And so if it's our goal to get them there, we have to repair that relationship. We can't say, oh, well, that's a bad relationship, moving on to the next thing. Just get a GED, you'll be fine. That might work for some. But it's important for us to hold this institution of education accountable to make sure that we create learning, healing-informed learning spaces. And so I'm excited by the Department of Education's new directions around these conversations about trauma, because I think it does provide an opportunity for us to deeply interrogate what it means to have a healing location for learning. And so these are new conversations. I'm thrilled that y'all are so young in this space, because that means that hopefully you'll be engaged in the development of this discussion, and that when we start to think about who might be the next series of teachers, who might be the next folks who are producing research in this area, how we are engaged in participatory practices around co-constructing what a safe, healing-informed learning space is, all of that can come from young scholars like you in partnership with those who are also living and breathing in these spaces. So I just want to share that, and how much I love that you're even thinking about that, because that's the next direction.
And I'll just add, there's a lot of schools, particular, that have this situation, right? East Oakland, Chicago, that are under-resourced. And so one of the things I suggest is, sometimes we can't, yes, we want the whole system to change, right? But we know how to change is slow. So what do we do about it now, right? And why not do something innovative, like figure out, get with some of your friends, think about what it is that you'd want a classroom to be like, what kind of field trips you could create, and actually pitch it to the school. Yeah. So doing some things like that, it's not a whole overhaul of the system, but it's something. And sometimes it's just the somethings that start adding up and getting people to shift. That's kind of the community aspect of it. So, and the reason that I'm saying this is because I was working at a Southside charter school, continuation school, and that's the situation that they had. And so I went to them and I said, hey, I want to pitch something, especially for your girls, because they had already been kicked out. They were, involved in the juvenile justice or foster care and so on. And I want to do more empowerment, showing the skills that they had. They didn't need to be taught new skills. Mm-hmm. They needed to be shown what they could do with the existing ones. Because right now we have that kind of approach where it's like, we need to correct something in you, instead of saying we need to bring something out in you.
Yes.
And that's what we were doing, and I found was really powerful. And it was unfortunate because this school, right, because of struggling for resources, I was talking to one of the girls and she said that they had art class. Art class was my favorite. I went through a lot of trauma. Art was huge for me. I took art all through college. I draw, and actually, Cara has one of my paintings in her office. And so I asked her, I said, well, what do you do in this art class? She said, oh, well, I sit at a computer. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. She said, I sit at a computer, I put headphones on, and I listen to a teacher, so it's remote. And then what does the teacher say? The teacher directs me, like, it's watercolor. So they put a canvas, comes up on the screen, and then I get to choose what brush is for watercolor and what paint. I said, so you never actually touch a brush? No. So those are the kinds of things. So you know what that school needed was to actually get kids to touch brushes. So to start doing more of that kind of conversations, and you could do it now. You don't have to wait, and you could do it for very cheap. I think that's when you start making shift happen.
That's an excellent idea. I want to offer one more, because there was a girl who was local who talked about, I asked her, what happens when you get suspended? She said, well, I fight. And I said, well, describe that process for me. And she said, well, it takes all day to plan a fight, right? She's like, so you have to, figure out where you're going to meet. You have to figure out who's going to be there. You got to figure out what you're going to wear. You got to figure out, like, she went through the entire thing. And when she finished, I said, you realize you're an amazing organizer, right? And she looked at me and she said, well, what does that mean, right? No one had talked to her about her organization skills. No one had talked to her about the dedication she put into the attention to detail, right? And when I was talking to her, she got excited about the idea of organizing. And in the same way that you said, it wasn't about you not having skills, it was about how you were directing those skills. She was finally able to see that perhaps she could organize for something that was liberative, not for something that's oppressive. And so these kinds of conversations only come when people see them. If we don't see them, then we don't have these conversations. So I just, you can engage. Sometimes it's as simple as touch a brush. Sometimes it's about getting them in a space where they can see themselves in you and where you become that one adult that they needed a relationship with to understand how to direct their skills.
Let me just jump in here 1 second, because both Monique and Patricia are talking about how important it is to engage with young people. And I also want us to think a bit about how important and difficult and challenging it can be to engage with the frontline actors in the system, right? The people who are handling those interactions, who are responding to young people and trying to transform their understanding. And we know some of these folks may be rooted in a belief that they are helping, right? The tough love approach is helping. Right? And so I would love for each of you just to reflect a bit on strategies you have for engaging people on the front line in whatever institutions that you're engaging with. Angela,
So I think I immediately start to disaggregate, well, who's on the front line? And I think that there are, I think we have the stereotypical probation chiefs, judges, who are law and order, stop and frisk. We heard a lot about that last night. And I think that in terms of those of us who are interested in system change and just social change, I think I've been really moved by how, at least in the justice system, most people are in the justice system because they care about young people, and they may have a slightly wrong lens. But I think that I have found that that I've been able to move many, many people to think about how to act differently, right? So I've been able to use numbers to make system people realize how many LGBT kids are there, and then they realize that they've been blind to how many LGBT kids have been there, and you sort of, in these trainings, you see eyes change, and you see people think, oh shit, I've completely missed this whole group of people, and I have to do better. And so I've moved Republicans, right? I've moved these old white guys to think differently about how to act towards young people in their system. And at the same time, many of the frontline actors are leaders of color who day to day have to negotiate with people who do not trust them, do not believe how smart they are, who do not believe their intentions. And so I'm just going to tell this one story of being in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania this last week. I visited a program run by Daniel Elby, who's now an elderly black man who's been working with the Harrisburg justice system for 41 years. He runs a secure facility for 15 kids, and he runs 5 homes, residential homes, that also are limited to 15 beds. And he runs. It just is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. If you walk into these plants, the secure facility looks like a jail, but he transcends it because all of his staff are black. They build relationships with these young black men. They have they are treating these young men as kids, and yet at the same time, Mr. Elby has to fight for his ability to do that every day. So it just, so there's, in a weird way, there's a lot of hope in what I just said, but also just, it's not that it's easy, and the people that are doing it every day, it's definitely a battle that deserves support.
Systems don't create themselves, right? So people create them. So for me, I always find that the answer is always relationships. And I find that a lot of people are really disconnected advocates. So I think that by creating opportunities for people to get more connected to their why, why they got into it in the first place, a lot of people forget it along the way. We also don't pay people very much. We overwork them. That's problematic. But getting them connected also to the successes, right? And not seeing things as kind of a short term, but more so of a long-term game. But I think the biggest way that you see change is by creating more opportunities for people like ourselves to assume those roles. Because that's what it is. Anytime I turn on C-SPAN and I don't see anybody like me, we're not going to get there like we really want to get there. And But at the same time, I think what I find is a lot of people who really have that heart and that connection to do the work for high tuition, whatever reasons, end up not going into these really important fields and taking on those really important positions. And I think that part is something that we actually need to start addressing. So for instance, at my law school, primarily the people who could go into public interest were the people who could afford it. And that's an issue, right? So connection and relationships, for sure with me, it's tough. Because the higher you climb, the less it looks like you. And being able to stay true to yourself and to your goal and what you want to do, especially within a system that doesn't necessarily prioritize humanity and heart space, right? It's more just about judicial efficiency. It can be challenging, but I think that we continue to tell the stories, to have the voices, making sure that they're not just in the room, but they have a seat at the table. That's what I find. I find that there are so many judges who have never been to any juvenile detention center, don't know any of the kids, have never been to their neighborhood, have never seen, where they grew up. So there's no connection. It's just really easy. But I think if you start getting people connected to that and why they did it because they really believed that children could, follow their dreams and change, I think that's when you'll start to see the shift. But, that's my opinion.
I think I have found, I sort of blend both of these styles around data and narrative storytelling. And I think it's important to do that blend, but really, I think where I'm starting to see there to be tremendous opportunity is in working at the intersections. And this is probably like the third or fourth time I've said that now. And I say that to you because I'm hopeful that if you walk away from this, you remember, she kept talking about working at the intersections, right? And what does that mean? And I really want you to continue to interrogate what that means. Intersectionality is about the recognition that there must not be a single axis from which we work, that multiple identities shape who we are, and it informs how we engage with systems, structures, and people. And so if that is true, then that means that we can't just work on a single issue and think that will provide us with, or work with a single body and think that that will get us to the desired effect. Because these intersections are not just about how we as individuals are interacting with systems, but also how these systems are interacting with each other to impact us. I'll give you an example. So just yesterday, the no such thing, I call it the no such thing law, was signed into California law. You can no longer in this state prosecute a girl for prostitution because there is no such thing as a child prostitute. Give it up one time. That's important. And it was after years and years and years of folks trying to say, okay, we have children who are commercially sexually exploited. Please stop saying they're choosing this life. Please stop saying that this is something that they want to do. Please stop saying that you're protecting them by putting them in detention facilities and jails. This is not helping. You are criminalizing them. You are not helping, right? So we're telling stories. Folks are writing books and writing papers and telling stories, and data are emerging, and folks are saying, look, this is not a niche population. This is a broader, growing population. They may not be arrested for prostitution, but they still have significant histories of sexual exploitation if they are justice system involved, right? This is something we have to pay attention to. But importantly, there were also these opportunities to say, okay, how can we bring girls, women who have been affected by this life to the table to construct policy, to talk about their own experiences, to talk about what they would want to see happen differently in a way that could be meaningful to policymakers, that could be meaningful to researchers, that could be meaningful to the general public. Billboards went up, campaigns were out. The no such thing vocabulary comes from a young woman who was commercially sexually exploited. So we use this no such thing language now because of her. And so there are ways in which, working at the intersections means not that you align on a single issue, which is how a lot of campaigns are run. Folks will say, well, you believe in this and I believe in that. The only thing we share is this one little bit, so let's partner on this one little bit. That doesn't build capacity. What builds capacity is when you're able to say your institution has a vested interest in this person being a part of this conversation. And it may not be a happy, gentle conversation all the time, but you can push past that in order for there to be some meaningful systemic change. And I think that, the fact that we cannot do that anymore in this state, that it elevated from a girl who was saying, there's no such thing as a child prostitute, stop calling me that, to now this governor signing into law a bill that says you cannot prosecute girls for prostitution anymore, is significant. It's something we should study. It's something we should examine. Because I think it can inform other social movements where we're talking about people who are excluded and who themselves are living at the intersections.
I know you've been waiting for some time, so.
I just wanted to say to all the speakers that you're really cool people. And also, if this makes any sense at all, how influential do you think popular media is on people's perceptions of other people and themselves? And what would you like to see, changes relating to your field of study?
Oh, yeah. I would like to see ex-convict never written,
Right.
felon never written in newspapers or reported in the media, or this person has an extensive criminal history, because it automatically sets people up to say that this person is blameworthy, automatically. So that, number one, for me, it's sexy headlines, it's unfortunate, and it's really problematic. So for me, I'd like to see that go, for sure.
I feel like sometimes I'm able to work in a space, actually a lot of times I'm able to work in a space where popular media actually doesn't affect what's happening in a good way. So for example, the work that I'm doing to divert LGBT youth out of the justice system is oftentimes with system people like probation chiefs who don't even have time to follow popular media. And so relationships with specific people can actually transcend the craziness of popular media, and and maybe it's an age thing. Like my my generation is less likely to be attached to Twitter and Instagram, but I think that while popular media is incredibly powerful, I think that interpersonal relationships can transcend that.
I would just like to see the memes, the very destructive memes, go away. Yes. I think that they are informing so much and distorting so much perception about identities and perpetuating in many ways a violence that I find very problematic. So I think it can be a very powerful tool, and I love when social media, new media are used in creative ways to advance thinking. I hate when it's used to perpetuate violence. So, that's where I would like to see it. That can just go.
So we are at 5 o'clock now, and we can imagine that we could continue this conversation on and on and on. What I promised you, and I was very confident we would deliver, is a roadmap. And what I hope that you heard is that in each example that a panelist gave is a signpost, is a roadmap, is a guideline for people who are trying to imagine their own careers in a social justice career, in a social justice path. It's a roadmap. And certainly, I think we can all agree that we got some inspiration, right? So let's thank the panelists.